As I work with people in toxic relationships, it's clear that the traditional counseling and advice and wisdom that goes along with most relationships or troubled relationships is actually counterproductive and doing more harm than good. And this is not a dig at my very skilled and caring counselor friends who are doing their very best. Rather, it's a reflection of the hidden, ugly dynamics at play in a toxic situation when you're dealing with a relationship bully. Let me explain. Toxic people, relationship bullies, abusers, they get their kicks from being in control, controlling the narrative, the situation, the people around them, others' perceptions of them, and that includes counselors. These bullies, they crave, require, and demand control. And I go into the reasons for this and the behavior that it drives more in depth in the online course titled Stop Emotional Abuse, if you're interested to learn more. Traditional counseling and advice unknowingly feeds into the bully's unhealthy need for control in the following 5 ways. The first bit of traditional counseling. You both have things to work on. Each of you should work on your own issues and you should try harder. Now, that is true in any relationship. We all have issues on which to work, but here's why that's so damning in a toxic relationship. For years, the abused person has heard from their partner that they, the abused one, are the cause for the problems in the relationship. And if they would just shape up and do exactly what the bully is telling them to do, that everything would be better. Believing that to be true because the bully is so convincing and genuinely wanting a better relationship, the abused person goes about setting things right, doing their very best to meet what are usually very unreasonable demands from the abuser. And because the abused person is often codependent, meaning they'll do whatever it takes to make the relationship better, that's exactly what they'll do, whatever it takes. No matter what the abused person does, though, it's never enough. Because of the insatiable need for control that the bully has, it will cause them to move the goalpost every time that the abused person gets closer. By changing the rules of the game and creating chaos, the bully can again have control of the situation. I mean, think about it. What better way to control a situation than to create it? Wanting to do what the counselor, the professional, has suggested and willing to do whatever it takes to improve the relationship, what does the abused person do? They try harder, which only perpetuates this unhealthy cycle. The second bit of traditional counseling, of go back to what drew you to each other in the first place and rekindle that, here's why that one doesn't work. This one is particularly frustrating for the abused person because they would absolutely love for the person that the bully initially was to come back. They've been waiting for that for months, possibly even years, for that version to reappear. And that's what keeps them holding on, hoping beyond hope, clinging to this toxic relationship. But here's the reality. That person is never coming back. That charming, wonderful, caring, perfect person that the abuser once was, and that the abused partner hopes comes back, only existed as a facade. It was a fake persona used long enough to draw the abused person in. The abuser carefully conducted this ruse of being the perfect match for their partner to lure that unsuspecting person in so that they could control them once that person was intoxicated with the bully's love bombing. And once that person was willing to do whatever it took to hopefully get back some of that euphoric high that they felt when they were the most important person in the world to the abuser. If that sounds dire, the fact that it was a carefully constructed ruse, please understand that I've understated it. Check out the online course, Stop Emotional Abuse, for a very clear explanation on all of this. And by the way, no, the abuser does not know consciously that they're doing this. This traditional advice to go back to the origins of the relationship perpetuates the toxic cycle because the abused person believes that if the counselor thinks it's possible to recreate that dynamic, which would be heaven for them, they'll continue to hold on to false hope. The third bit of traditional counseling. Be more open and more vulnerable with each other. Share what's on your heart and mind to increase the emotional intimacy. Oh boy, this one is a gold mine for the bully. The abuser loves it when the abused person is vulnerable because it gives the abuser ammunition to use against the abused person later. The bully loves to use what's important to the abused person as currency to get what they want later. And what does the bully want? Control. So they'll use the most meaningful things, the things most important to their partner, as leverage against them. The more the abused person shares, the more the bully can use against them later. Does that sound sick and unbelievable and unlikely? I wish it were, but it's not in the least. I coach dozens and communicate with thousands of people in these situations, and the pattern is always the same. My friend Mary lost her dad several years ago when he committed suicide. Her mentally abusive partner mocked her for how she grieved that loss. After 13 years of marriage and wanting to create more closeness through vulnerability, my friend Matt told his emotionally abusive wife about the most poignant emotional trauma that he had had in his childhood. And it was related to his father. Her response was cold. uncaring, totally void of connection. She didn't see anything wrong with her response. In fact, she justified it even further when he mentioned how hurtful that response was to him. When it comes to a bully, an abuser, anything you say can and will be used against you to hurt you and to keep them in control. The fourth bit of traditional counseling: tell me what's bothering you about the other person. Now, remember what the bully wants: control, power, to not look weak or inadequate. So guess what happens when the abused person shares anything with the counselor about what's bothering them? The bully will tear into the abused person as soon as they get into the car, rip them up and down for making them look bad. The more the abused partner shares with the counselor, the worse it will be for them later. So they learn to stop sharing, they clam up. And that plays right into the bully's desires of looking powerful and innocent of any wrongdoing. And it puts them in control of the situation. Because then the bully can say, look, it's my partner who's the problem. They can't think of one thing they want me to change. Obviously, they need the work, not me. If I don't have anything to work on, I guess the only thing wrong in our relationship is that my partner doesn't see how much I do for them, how good I am for them. They can totally twist and manipulate this situation. It's sick, twisted, and it's real, and it plays together with the previous point about vulnerability. The bully gets this huge kick out of looking like the saint. But don't counselors see through this, do you ask? No. And that brings us to the next reason why traditional counseling doesn't work. Traditional counselors aren't trained to see this. The abuser is charming, and they will often convince the therapist, just like they do everybody else, that there's no issue, at least not on their side. The bully is skilled at painting the exact picture they want others to see. So counselors who aren't skilled in this area are unfortunately no less vulnerable to the abuser's manipulation than other people are. The reason is that they, like other people who haven't experienced this type of abuse up close and personal, they don't know the signs, which can be so hard to spot, especially in a clinical setting where the abuser puts on this good show. Another reason for it is that the traditional counselor, just like anyone else who hasn't lived with an abuser, can't comprehend that somebody would actually behave the way that the abused partner is trying to describe. The counselor and everybody else who hasn't lived it tries to apply a normal human logic to this situation in an attempt to understand it. And that's why they often say, well, what did you do to set the other person off? Or what is your role in this problem? The problem is, if you're trying to understand psychosis through the lens of sanity, you're going to find it's a losing battle. You cannot understand abusive behaviors through the lens of normal. Abusive behavior can only be seen through the proper lens. And since most people who haven't lived in this situation don't know what to look for, they perpetuate the bully's desires. I've experienced it. I've seen it. I've seen it play out with others time and time again. An additional point here is that the abused person has difficulty putting the abuse into words since it's so insidious and because of something real called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. Because of that, it's hard to verbalize the treatment that you've received. This adds to the difficulty for a traditional counselor to sort through what's really happening. So let me recap. Traditional advice and counseling doesn't work in toxic relationships. The advice of you both have things to work on perpetuates the unhealthy cycle of codependence and abuse. The advice of go back to what drew you to each other in the first place promotes false hope. Being more vulnerable to each other exposes the abused partner to more abuse. Telling the counselor what's bothering the abused partner will lead to more abuse. And traditional counselors, as wonderful as they are, they just don't have the insight and the experience to spot this kind of abuse. Heck, it's hard for the one living in it to know what's happening. If you or someone you know has struggled to get answers or lasting results from other resources and traditional avenues, and you'd like to better understand how to recognize and deal with a toxic partner, visit stopemotionalabuse.net to learn more.